Tzarayim Tovim. Good afternoon, all. This week, I'm going to be discussing our double portion of the week, Parshat BeHar BeHukotei, the end of Sefer Vayikra. Next week, we start with Bamidbar, the meanderings of our B'nai Yisrael, Bamidbar, in the desert. And deserts can be many different things. The following week is actually Shavuot. So I will not be doing a Devar Torah that week. I will be taking the week off. And of course, we will be a week behind because in Israel, since it's Yom Sheni, they will be in their normal Shabbat Parsha, and we will just have to add another double Parsha to catch up later. So I do a lot of teaching about community. And of course, we all live in communities. And given the work that I do, whether it's with LGBTQ plus folks in the Orthodox Jewish world, whether it's in my multi-faith world, if it's with women, working with Giorim, with converts, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. But finding the pushback in community in terms of who they accept or who is authentic in terms of their Jewish identity and all of that, I think we all need to be honest, take a few steps backwards, and recognize what it means to be part of this Erev Rav, this mixed multitude that left Mitzrayim. Who left? Who did not leave? We presented to our kids like, oh, the Jews got up and they all left and they all baked their matzah and it was very quick and they took this cardboard. Actually, it was much more like lafa than the matzah that we eat. Thank you, Barry Dollinger, for doing that up in Rhode Island. And how do we talk about ourselves given that the group may not have been as pure as we think and that our own identity may not be as pure as we think? So who was standing at that mountain, BeHar? Who was accepting BeHukotei, those rules? So I want to begin going back to Shemot, chapter 12 and following, where we're told, Kumu, Tz'u mitoch ami, gam atem, gam B'nai Yisrael, l'chu ibdu et Hashem k'dibachem. Moshe and Aharon go and they advocate for the children of Israel. Pharaoh calls to them at this point and says, get up, leave my people. Tz'u mitoch ami. He's making a dividing line. Leave. Egyptians stay, Jews leave. Your B'nai Yisrael, and go and worship your God as you have said. Take your flocks, take everybody. The Egyptians go, okay, yeah, get out of here. We don't want you here anymore. You're doing nothing but bringing us trouble. The people picked up their dough, they left. And then in verse 38, we read, V'gam erev rav alaytam. And also a mixed multitude went with them. Now Rashi says that this mixed multitude was potential converts from different nations. So why did they join them? What did they see? If this group of people were so hated by the Mitzrayim, what did these other nations see? We talk about this story in a very simple kind of dynamic, Egyptians, Israelites. But what we forget to acknowledge is that you always are going to have Erev Rav. You're always going to have various people mixed with you. We all live in neighborhoods that involve people of different faiths, different races, different ethnic origins, and so on and so forth. So what is the deal here? Right after this verse we read, and God says to Moshe and Aharon, Zot chukat Pesach, this is the law of Pesach, Kol ben necher lo yochal bo. Any person who is not a Jew, necher, anyone outside, necharim, sometimes used to express other nations' identities, cannot partake of it. So Rashi says something else. Rashi says from the Mechilta, whose deeds have become estranged from God in heaven, that it means both non-Jews and Jews who are not observing the rules as they are given to him. It then says, after this explanation, that they were to circumcise any of the avadim, any of the slaves or the servants that they took to become part of the people, and in order to enable them to eat of this Pesach. Kol adat Yisrael yatzuoto. Everyone who is part of Israel will be part of this. And if there is a ger, a stranger who lives amongst you, and wants to be part of the Paschal celebration, then you will circumcise him. And then it says, that he will be like a citizen of your land. And anyone who is uncircumcised will not eat of the offering. And then we have this wonderful line in verse 49, still from the text in Shemot. There's one law for you, for the native, the citizen, and for the stranger, for the other, who lives in your midst. Now, what's very interesting is in these relatively few Pesukim, we have the following terms. Kol adat Yisrael, all of the nation of Israel. Erev Rav, the mixed multitude. Ezrach, citizen. Kol B'nai Yisrael, all the children of Israel. Ulager hager b'tocham, and the stranger that dwells amongst you, v'kol harel, and everyone who is uncircumcised. So thinking about how do we reconcile the fact that the groups that are involved are referred to in different ways. We could do one of my very complicated Venn diagrams to see who fits where and who may fit in more than one category. And what other lines of delineation do we note through our narrative? And finally, how is this relevant to us today? So we know that many, many, many times in the Torah we read, "V'ger lo telchatz v'atam yadatam et nefesh hager ki gerim hayitim be'eretz Mitzrayim." So this word ger, potential convert, gior, stranger, we were strangers. One of the things that I have noticed through the years is the term goy, for example. People will use goy with a pejorative meaning. But you know that we're called a goy kadosh, right? So goy just means a people, a collective. It's not a pejorative term in and of itself, but it certainly becomes a pejorative term in what is called stipulative linguistics. In other words, given the context in which you use a word, it acquires a negative meaning and loses what was potentially its neutral meaning. So we have that here with ger, the mixture where ger and Yisrael are seen as one and the same. So how do we feel about this? How do we talk about this in terms of, again, who was at the mountain and who do we think about when we talk about BeHukotei tishmeru, that you shall observe all of my laws, all of you, and it's an inclusive. So Jonathan Sacks teaches as follows, and I'm going to begin quote and then I will end quote. What is the definition of a stranger? Clearly the reference is to one who is not Jewish by birth. It could mean one of the original inhabitants of the land of Canaan. It could mean one of the mixed multitude who left Egypt with the Israelites. It might mean a foreigner who has entered the land seeking safety or a livelihood, sanctuary. Whatever the case, immense significance is attached to the way the Israelites treat the stranger. This was what they were meant to have learned from their own experience of exile and suffering in Egypt. They were strangers. They were oppressed. Therefore, they know intrinsically how it feels to be a stranger. They were not to inflict on others what was once inflicted on them. The sages held that the word ger might mean one of two things. One was a ger tzedek, a convert to Judaism who had accepted its commandments and obligations. The other was the ger toshav, the one who resides amongst you but does not accept these commandments. What then is a ger toshav, the one who is the resident alien? There are three views in the Gemara. According to Rabbi Meir, it was anyone who took it upon himself not to worship idols. According to Chazal, it was anyone who committed to observing the 7 mitzvot shel b'nei Noah, the 7 Noahic commandments that were ordained for the children of Noah. A third view holds that it was someone who had undertaken to observe all the commandments of the Torah, except for one, the prohibition of not eating meat that was ritually slaughtered. And that's according to Avodah Zarah 64b. The law follows the sages, those who take on the Noahide commandments. A ger toshav is thus a non-Jew living in Israel who accepts the Noahide laws binding on everyone. Look at the Israeli government today and a lot of the angst around the laws and any kind of separation of church and state or synagogue and state. And it's a very difficult and complicated matter. There's a wonderful organization in Israel dedicated to studying this called the Israel Democracy Institute, or the Institute for Democracy in Israel. I forget which way it goes. But Google it, you will find it, learn about it. It's amazing. Ger Toshav legislation, going back to Rabbi Sachs, is thus one of the earliest extant forms of minority rights. According to the Rambam, there's an obligation on Jews of Israel to establish courts of law for resident aliens to allow them to settle their own disputes according to the Noahide laws, not Jewish law. Think about that. The Rambam adds, one should act towards resident aliens with the same respect and loving kindness one would do to a fellow Jew. Hilchot Malachim 10:12. So here we have a group of people. We know that all Jews did not leave Mitzrayim. In fact, we're told that maybe 20% of them left, as much as 80% may have stayed. Then we have all these big numbers. We talk about the 60 myriads of Israelite men who left Egypt, Erev Rav, a mixed multitude. And remember, they went from place to place to place to place. And as you go from place to place to place to place, your population is not constant. Some will get off the boat, so to speak, and stay. Others will come on. So as time goes on, the mixed multitudes change. Gerald Aronoff wrote significantly about this, and I want to take from some of his research. He teaches as follows. The Zohar says that when we look at these Gerim, they were Egyptian converts. Who were the mixed multitudes? Were they Lydians? Were they Ethiopians? Were they Cyprians? Were they not all Egyptians? And did they all not come from Egypt? If they had considered of a mixture of many different nations, would not the plural used alu as opposed to Allah? Erev Rav is treated as a singular, not as a plural. Now, what he's doing is something that is often done in looking at the language of Torah, where every word is seen as significant and intentional. So if it's plural or singular, there's a reason, and there's a lot of commentary around that. He says that the mixed multitude must have consisted entirely of one people, all of whom spoke the same language, because when they beheld all the things that happened, somehow they were conversing amongst themselves. But it is possible that other strangers, on the other hand, like Fiddler on the Roof, there are many hands here, may have joined from other peoples. So why would they have joined? What did they see in the Israelites? What did they perceive as being so special that they wanted to cast their lot with this people who were going into the desert, leaving their homes, good, bad, or indifferent, leaving the food, leaving everything that was there? Remember, the Israelites will complain. We'll see all their complaints and all their angst in the next Sefer of the Torah in Bamidbar, in the desert, where they feel so isolated and so forgotten and so at wit's end. So why would people want to join them? We have evidence, says Dr. Aronoff, that this group did in fact follow the Israelites, but that they stayed separate. And in fact, when the Amalekites attack Israel, some will say that this was the group that may have been the most impacted. We talk about the weak and the sick and all that. But the fact of the matter is, somewhere here, we suspect that they became part of Israel. Again, who is standing at the mountain? Who is there accepting following the dictate to follow all the rules? Even though the Torah informs us that God befriends the stranger and commands us to do the same, we are told in Devarim, you must too befriend the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Dr. Aronoff makes a distinction between those of the different nations who may have joined the Jews and those Egyptians who never truly joined the Israelites and actually created all kinds of trouble during the years of wandering through the desert. Now, some of our folks especially in our more right-pitched community that like to see things as good or bad or what have you, and how can we imagine that, Jews did these terrible things, all these commandments that they were fighting against, and all the complaining and being part of Korach and, all of these different things. So there are those who want to say that these were not really part of the Israelites, but that they were these outsiders that were there and were ready to sort of sabotage what the Israelites were doing. Whether we agree with that or we don't agree with that, lo chashuv, it is a thought, and it's understandable that people can be very, very concerned, disturbed, somewhere in between those two, that our people would do such terrible things. We get that. So Shaul Bar, a professor at the University of Memphis, has a journal article, Who Was the Erev Rav? Who were the mixed multitude? He suggests that we may be talking about Egyptian slaves who joined the Israelite slaves. So now going back to Egypt, were all the masters Egyptian? Were all Egyptians masters? Were all Jews slaves? Were all slaves Jews? So what Bar is suggesting is that we may be talking about Egyptians who had intermarried or come with their adopted families, or they were Egyptian mercenaries who intermarried and thus brought their weapons with them, explaining how the Jews were armed in conflict. We often talk about how when they left Egypt, they came with all these gifts, and some say that they borrowed them, some said that the Egyptians gave them. So here, what we have is the rebels, if you will, in Egypt are actually coming with the Jews. So we talk about these very purist groups, and we want to believe that it's so clear to us who is part of the group, who is not part of the group, but it's not so clear. It just cannot be a slam dunk. So in Kabbalah, again, we have a problem because we don't want to admit that the Jews would have done things that were less than honorable. So we relegate them to other people, or we talk about those that were not really part of the B'nai Yisrael. And in that sense, we learn God did not want to accept these unfit hangers-oners, these parts of the Erev Rav. It is said that they remained separate, and therefore, when reward or punishment was meted out, it was clear who should be rewarded and who should not. I would suggest that that is missing the point. It's very easy to follow the cartoon world and say the good guys and the bad guys. And yay, good guys, boo, bad guys. But we are human beings. And to use the notion that this Erev Rav would be people that were really no good and deserve to be punished and da-da-da-da, I think is missing the point. We learn all along that other people are wonderful people. It's not that Jews have a market on being wonderful, and it's not that there are no Jews that do anything wrong. Ben Gurion said, we know that it will be a Jewish state when we have Jews in jail. Well, they do, and we do. So we know that it's not a slam dunk what group you are in terms of who becomes corrupted and who corrupts others. The other part of this, coming forward in history, is who are we? Are we slam dunk Jews, or are we part of the Erev Rav? We used this as a theme at our Pesach Seder this year, and I went around the table and I asked everybody, so how do you know you're Jewish? So of course we know you're either you have a Jewish mother or you went through a proper Giur L'Chumrah, proper conversion. So we have a child who's adopted, our dear Brian Victor, and we go around the table, and everyone around the table says, my mother, my mother, my mother, my mother. We get to Brian Victor, and he says, I went through a conversion. Then I informed the table, only one of us is slam dunk 100% Jewish. Which one? It's the one who went through Giur L'Chumrah. Why? And here we go. This is the work of Aaron Ackland. It's called The Missing Link of Jewish European Ancestry, Contrasting the Rhineland and the Khazarian Hypothesis. The question of Jewish ancestry has been the subject of controversy for over 2 centuries and has yet to be resolved. The Rhineland hypothesis depicts Eastern European Jews as a population isolate that emerged from a very small group of German Jews who migrated eastward and expanded rapidly. Alternatively, the Khazarian hypothesis suggests that the Eastern European Jews descended from the Khazars, an amalgam of Turkish clans that settled the Caucasus in early centuries of the Common Era and converted to Judaism in the 8th century of the Common Era. Mesopotamia and Greco-Roman Jews continuously reinforced the Judaized empire until the 13th century. Following the collapse of their empire, these Judeo-Khazars fled to Eastern Europe. The rise of European Jewry is therefore explained by the contribution of the Judeo-Khazars. Thus far, however, their contribution is questionable, as is the absence of genetic proof that they are in fact Jews. So there's a lot of thinking that there was a period in the Middle Ages in the Ashkenazic world where there was this very, very small group of Jews, and that it was virtually impossible for that small group of Jews to really produce the millions of Jews that we now talk about. Further, in the Christian world, which is the predominant culture of the European world at that time, Muslims are more East and Southern. The identity culturally went by the father. Remember, originally, Jewish identity is by the father. All you have to do is look at the families in Breshit. The mother becoming the identifying factor of the genetic Jewish line is during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah due to all the intermarriages and the interactions and the notion that you always know who the mother is but not the father. And of course, we end up in this bizarre situation, which we don't necessarily think about, but the lineage comes down from the mother. The tribal identity comes down by the father. You could end up with, this is one of the reasons a Kohen cannot marry someone who comes from another culture and convert it in. So you could end up theoretically be a Kohen according to the father, but a non-Jew according to the mother. I did a lot of work with Russian families coming out of the Soviet Union in the 80s when I was head of in those days, a Bureau of Jewish Education. And I can't tell you how many times I'm sitting at the table, he's wearing a kippah and she has a cross. And that was normative for them. And we're putting the kids in day school and we're suggesting synagogues. And it was, you don't say to somebody who left Russia because of whatever the reasons were, religion, socioeconomic, better life, whatever, well, you're not really Jewish. Your kids have to be converted in order for us to work with you. So at Al-Chesed, we put them in schools. We did what we did. I conferred with all the rabbis. I got approval for this. And then for bar bat mitzvah, they would deal with the kids' identities. We are all Erev Rav. If we go back, now with all the DNA testing, we probably could find that if you go back, the mother's mother, da-da-da-da-da, may not have been Jewish. Now, we have a chazaka, and we agree that after many generations, we accept it. But strange enough, in the Israeli government right now, in terms of some of the angst over some of the requests for aliyah, this issue is coming back to haunt people, believe it or not. So the problem is, how do we know who we are? How do we know who our community is? How pure are we And how quickly are we to say that we are not part of the Erev Rav? So just to think about this in terms of our lives, what happens when you find out that someone you thought was a member of your religious grouping is not? What happens when you, as a member of that religious grouping, finds out that you are not? There's a movie that is Israeli that I recommend you watch. It's called The Green Chariot. That is exactly a story of that case. What happens when this kid who is getting married, who is a big leader in B'nai Akiva, who is this wonderful young man who's gone through everything, finds out that his mother's mother's mother was not Jewish. And how does he deal with that? And then what do we say to an entire Ashkenazic world who claims that through maternal lines, we are members of the B'nai Yisrael all the way back in our lineage, and then we can prove that this is not so through our DNA. So this is a problem. We know, for example, that we do not have non-Jews. Many people frown at having non-Jews come to a Pesach Seder for all kinds of reasons. Some people say it's because of Yain Nesak, because of the Yain that we drink. Some say it's because we're going through this experience that purely was a Jewish experience. But now we're wondering, wait a minute, was Yetziat Mitzrayim 100% Jews and no one else? Or is that not the case? And then how do we deal with the ramifications of what we learn? So I would say, as someone who teaches people for conversion, who works with people around all kinds of issues, who deals with welcoming communities of our LGBT folks in our Orthodox Jewish world, I would say that if we go all the way back to Bereshit, chapter 15, verses 13 through 14, God says to Avram, "You will surely know that your children will be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. They will be enslaved and they will be afflicted." That we didn't all come out. Not everybody who came out with us was initially part of that group. And that Dam L'chav Zechut, we give the benefit of the doubt. I deal with conversion, and one of the things that just makes me crazy is this increasingly narrowing list of acceptable rabbis for the Orthodox rabbinate, whatever that is, and whatever secretary determines that is. And we'll give people all kinds of grief, and then we'll take money under the table, and all of a sudden, poof, you're Jewish. Just because someone is a Jew doesn't mean that everything is good and that nothing is bad. And that is true for all other people too. We need to think about identity in a different way. Who was standing at the mountain? Who has accepted God's rules, God's commandments? And how do we accept them? And what I would propose is that one's identity in terms of God is individual responsibility. Our responsibility as a collective, as a community, is to accept, is to welcome, is to figure out how we can include each other. Because it appears to me that with everything else we know about Yetziat Mitzrayim, as we get to the end of the book of Vayikra, the book of ritual purity, I find it ironic that it's at the end we have to ask ourselves some real questions about the purity of the identity of who we're talking about in discussing the B'nai Yisrael. So I want to end with some questions. What new thoughts do you have about who left Egypt, who is standing ready to accept Torah? And of course, as we know, we have Shavuot in a few weeks, which ends the period of Sfirat HaOmer and sandwiches this period of time when we think about these things. What uncertainty do these sources bring up about the purity of Jewish identity? In terms of our own backstory, what challenges are we left with to consider from various perspectives? Does this change anything about how we look at ourselves, others? And who may be the other? Who may be the ger in our midst? What responsibilities do we have toward each other, irrespective of who the individual is? Remember, Torat achad le'ezrach u'leger. There's one Torah for the citizen and for the stranger, or for the person that may not be part of that inside group. Are there others that are outside or inside of our community? And how do we balance the specific and particular lessons of this experience for us as Jews, and at the same time learn larger lessons it teaches about all of humanity and its many groupings? I'm in the process of preparing 2 papers, which will be 2 chapters in a book, for this international group that I'm involved with. And it's about inclusion and exclusion in our communities of faith. And for me, in the Jewish community, it's really simple. There's the relationship between the individual and God. There's the relationship between the community and God. And there's the relationship between the community and the individual. We don't judge. We accept. You're not supposed to ask somebody who's a convert about their past. You're not supposed to embarrass anybody. You're supposed to protect all lives. Those masses from other people who were leaving Mitzrayim, one must imagine that they may have been at the same level of risk for survival as the Jews were. And maybe they were attracted to the slaves that left, to the group that left Mitzrayim, precisely because there were values, there were foundational understandings of what makes a community and how to act. And if that people were acting properly during their years in the desert, notwithstanding the various stories that we know, then maybe these folks of the Erev Rav learned something. And maybe by the time they stood at BeHar and at the mountain and heard BeHukotei, these are my rules, maybe all did accept. And if they didn't accept it full-fledged as Jews, we go back to Chazal. They were observing the 7 Noahide commandments, and therefore could be part of the collective that believed in God. Let us all remember that identity is a complicated matter, and we need not be purists about this, but rather compassionate, caring, inclusive members of both B'nai Yisrael, the Jewish people, and B'nai Adam, the human family. Shabbat Shalom. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek.